And now it's time for you to reflect on what you've heard, particularly you, the jury, but also you, the audience, using the Q&A function again. We call this part the deliberation phase, and we want to hear from you which sections and which arguments made most sense. Specifically, I want to ask you which arguments did you feel were the strongest and most persuasive? Which arguments did you feel were weak and should be ignored? Our team will write them up so that we have a well-documented record of our deliberations. But now it's time to finally hear from our fantastic jury who've been selected specifically to represent the UK demographic. So jury, it's time for you to turn your cameras on at last so we can hear and see all of you. So which arguments did you feel Rebecca's were most strong?
So I thought the point about the £10 billion of resources being used to upgrade, that struck a chord with me in the sense that that's just an incredibly large amount of money that could be placed elsewhere, especially post-COVID.
I didn't feel like the UK was actually gaining anything from signing up to this treaty when ultimately it doesn't have to.
I guess the thing that I see is that actually both parties are arguing for the same thing. In many ways, we all want the same result, which is a world without nuclear weapons. And all that we're debating is the best way to achieve it.
From my perspective, I think the weakest arguments were around the aspects in which the TPNW is deficient, and there were comments around the overlap with other existing treaties, the fact that there was a failure to recognise existing latest standards, the lack of resources, etc. All of these things are to a great extent bureaucratic, which can be dealt with in the usual way through international diplomacy. I don't think any of those cut to the heart of the issue, which is there an adherence to the original NPT and clear concrete action by the UK government over a prolonged period that demonstrates its fundamental commitment to honour that treaty. Actually, criticism at the edges of the TPNW has no real bearing upon its efficacy or its relevance for the purposes of trying to progress the discussions for the next generation and the campaign towards a broader solution of peace.
In terms of Rebecca, I think she kind of summarised her argument really well. I think the main part of her argument, which was right at the beginning that really struck me, was when she talked about, she listed a lot of, like, many of the world leaders that we have today, and how comfortable are we with them having access to nuclear weapons, and particularly in the US, I believe that executive powers, the president himself can unilaterally depose nuclear weapons, and how comfortable are we as a global community knowing that these leaders are the ones with nuclear weapons?
I think that's strange. That was what I put down as a very weak argument, that I thought that to make a decision about nuclear weapons or not based on whether we like people or not, whether we trust world leaders or not, seems a strange argument to me when they're duly elected by their public. So I thought that was a weak argument.
But to my personal knowledge, no one person can trigger off these events. The Prime Minister here, for instance, does have the ultimate veto or yes, but it has to go through a whole string of recommendations and acceptances before it gets to that point.
Because Rebecca made the point that people like President Trump shouldn't necessarily be trusted with nuclear weapons, but he's been in power for 4 years and we've still not come close to a nuclear incident.
Okay, so I would like to say that the strongest point of Rebecca that I noticed was about the threat she talked about, that the threat is just spreading among the world about the nuclear disasters, and no denial in saying that the necessity is the mother of invention. And by making use of nuclear power constructively, it may prove boon to the society. At the same time, given the kind of law and order situations in the country like Pakistan and North Korea, the threat involved will not gonna confine to their territory only. And I would like to just give an example of my country, India. Our firm commitment that we are going to keep our nuclear power for defense purposes only, and never ever going to use it first. I'm just taking a midway in the both point of views, and I would like to add that the UK, the United Kingdom, can also keep their nuclear power for defense purposes and promise to never going to use it first, and or it can join the treaty for the peaceful and threat-free life of the citizens. It's totally
Thank you.
up to the country's situation.
I thought it was quite weak because I thought several times she changed what she was saying. I'm not sure if I misunderstood it, but to start with, she was saying they weren't in on it and didn't want to do it, and then said they were when she was asked the question.
I thought it was a particularly weak argument unless you happen to be a member of the SNP.
I wouldn't want to traduce anybody's thoughts about self-determination from a political perspective. What I would say is that it doesn't come as a surprise that members of a country where they have nuclear weapons placed on their turf by what they consider to be a sort of semi-absent power are not in favour of that. I think that's a very long and well understood argument. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a defining one. If you were to ask the residents of Berkshire, or apologies, I'm getting my counties wrong, but I suspect it's Berkshire where Aldermaston is, if they would like the facility there, I'm not sure many would like that. There is a certain element of not in my backyard NIMBYism about a lot of this topic. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a defining argument for my from my perspective. I think it's a sort of broader question. I guess for me, the broader question thereafter is, much as this is very interesting about the TPNW, actually what we're really talking about is not just non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, but there are other forms of weaponry which are potentially much more potent in the modern technologically interconnected world. This treaty is about the nefarious use of any sort of weaponized technology, whether that's nuclear technology or whether that's some other sort of intellectual technology, which could be used. And I thought many of these arguments could be portrayed more widely into that, accepting perhaps the environmental consequences. And I was surprised that neither of the witnesses made reference to the parallels to other areas of weaponry, because it gives us a rich seam of historical context from which to mount a particular argument in their favour or against.
But I did think it was a shame to state that he believes that nuclear is good value for money without having any numbers to back it up. It was challenging, actually, that both sides seems to claim that public opinion was in their favour without really unpacking what that meant. A YouGov poll seems like a very thin way to decide whether we have such weapons or not.
So someone said, whilst I respect James's expertise on international negotiations, I don't believe the new treaty will muddy the waters in the way he claims. I'm sure the international community will be able to deal with the overlap.
No, I thought Carol Hopper made a very, very good point, actually, and that is that both our speakers were heading in the same direction. It was not a question of where we were going, it was how we got there. And I think that's very valid indeed. And I don't know, I come back to one point which was raised all the way through, and that was one of how do you make sure that whether it's law or what it is, how do you make sure it is adhered to?
We have a comment from the audience that says, I believe the self-defense/deterrent arguments were very weak. The fear with nuclear weapons is that they can be utilised at any point by hostile countries. Country A might provide your justifications of learning potential attacks, whether they are true or not. With submarines becoming more detectable and information leaks growing more prominent, this is a greater concern. So I think this question is addressing the self-defense/deterrent arguments.
We know a number of things about the history of the Cold War. One of them is learned from the files from the double agent Oleg Gordievsky, which was that war games and other diplomatic exercises and communiques had been misrepresented and misunderstood constantly between the United Kingdom, the United States, and the USSR, which led us to very dangerous situations. I think, therefore, the suggestion that it is only less sophisticated or democratic or non-democratic powers, which might fall into the camp of bad actors or dangerous states, is a fallacy. I think it's a false dichotomy there. I think the second thing I would say is that when you look at the situation with respect to the use of nuclear weapons as a deterrent, this is a slightly old-fashioned and perhaps therefore unfashionable view, but there was a time not all that long ago when there was a large swathe of what we now consider to be free and liberal Europe, which was under the yoke of communism, and it lived in very difficult circumstances. And I agree with Carol's point that this should be all about the progress towards peace, but peace should be in the interests of improving people's quality of life. The reality is that there is a spectrum across which an international state might exert power, from the soft at one end, persuasion, diplomacy and aid, up to the other hard end, which is to do with military power. And there is a brutal truth, which is that some states and some actors require the use of hard military power in order to influence them. There was a time during the 60s, 70s and 80s where there were large swathes of Europe who looked to us as a bastion of freedom and liberal democracy, and our ability to influence states such as the USSR and systems such as communism was to a great extent driven by our opportunity, our potential to exert hard military power. That was a brutal truth which ultimately brought down a system which created injustices for very many millions of people. I question whether that would have been possible without the existence of our nuclear deterrent, whether that deterrent of itself deterred a nuclear attack, or whether it deterred the worst and most egregious excesses of a system which was intent upon oppressing its people. That's for others to debate, but I can see some arguments that James has around that area, which perhaps Rebecca is not paying full attention to.
Yeah, just tagging on to the argument of it being a deterrent. Rebecca said almost that nuclear weapons weren't a deterrent, and one example she gave for that is because we've come close to nuclear war 13 times, but I think that is more evidence that it is a deterrent rather than it isn't. It's strange to say that a deterrent doesn't work when there is no nuclear war. I'd agree with Rebecca that the cost of nuclear weapons is quite obscene, although I don't see a feasible alternative.
Now, we had a comment from the audience saying that, from someone saying they weren't convinced that the two treaties are incompatible and detract from each other. And then someone followed on from that saying the TPNW offers the non-nuclear states the right to be nuclear free. Does that matter to Britain?
It matters to Britain in the sense that that's a clear objective to keep the states that are non-nuclear in that state, as it were, so that they remain non-nuclear. So that matters because that's the overall objective. Does it matter to Britain in terms of driving their agenda and their processes? I'm not sure that it does, to be honest. I think that's, the answer, that the reason this treaty came about was out of frustration with recent progress. I think that's what Britain needs to address. So the way which we narrow the gap between what is a clear desire from non-nuclear states to both remain nuclear, but for the nuclear states to really get rid of their capacity. This is a very, very strong indication. So should drive an agenda taking us that way. That's why I do think we need to understand, it's all very well for James to say we have some of the best know-how and technological abilities in terms of verification and ultimately policing, because I think with everyone, policing is going to be part of the solution. It has to be.
What James was telling me is what's been going on and what's happened. What Rebecca was telling me seemed a bit ambiguous to me, and she didn't convince me that what she was saying was the way to go without there being if we were looking at anything else, we would want, this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen. And I didn't feel she answered the questions. I felt she actually politically went around them. I was more convinced by James's arguments.
I was just going to say that the thing that I was impressed with Rebecca was when she came in to respond to James about the P5 process.
If communication is key, do you feel that having both the NPT and the TPNW sort of makes communication less clear?
That was certainly James's point. His concern,
would you agree with that?
His concern definitely was that you're muddying the waters.
Yeah.
I think that it sounds to me like the new treaty will not be the platform for debate, because the existing people with the power to press the button, let's call it that, aren't engaging with it. So there needs to be a kind of middle way between the two, but the new treaty might force that to happen.
Why is it that you think that countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia would want to have such weapons if the proliferation and non-proliferation has protected us in the UK?
And my understanding is that those countries do want them.
Yeah.
So they've. I think the thing that should make us fearful is that I'm not sure they necessarily always want them for defensive purposes.
Okay.
That's certainly the case, I think, we see with North Korea.
Yeah.
And I suppose where I might be landing today, despite being someone who wants there to be no nuclear weapons in the world, is that those who are fortunate enough to be protected by others having nuclear weapons are happy to grandstand and say, you should get rid of them.
I think the comment about multilateral versus bilateral agreements is really interesting, because to a great extent the use and existence of nuclear weapons as a deterrent system, it's economically very punitive, and a large amount of the pressure which was brought to bear on the USSR and the US historically was economic, and that drove an awful lot of the debate around disarmament. I think what's really interesting, as somebody said, we've not mentioned, I think it was Brian said, we've not mentioned China recently. The suggestion would be that there is little, if any, economic pressure upon China in order to disarm. And so it leaves us in an interesting scenario whereby we may find ourselves in a situation where the developed, westernized members of the Security Council, who are nuclear nations, and as well as Russia, as well as the smaller nations who have nuclear capability, have an economic pressure bearing upon them and would be interested in disarmament, only to find that there is one country in possession of nuclear power who has no such pressure. And I question whether any element of the original TPN or the NPT or the TPNW would override that, or you simply would find yourself in a situation where you are then left with one superpower. And as we all know, that is a very dangerous situation.
Fundamentally, that is the driver behind all this debate. That is what the nub of it is. And I think China have made it very clear with COVID. I know we haven't mentioned COVID, but with COVID, they've made it very clear they're not interested in engagement with the international community to solve global issues.